The city skyline gleamed beneath the twilight. The skyline of a world divided by towering skyscrapers and invisible walls. In one of the tallest buildings in Manhattan, Richard Montgomery stood at the edge of his penthouse suite, looking out over the city. He was the definition of power, wealthy, ruthless, and untouchable. His company, Montgomery Enterprises, was one of the largest tech giants in the world, and he ruled his empire like a king. Tonight was no different than any other for Richard. The same luxurious surroundings, the same old crowd of powerful people who came to his penthouse for the same reason: to network, to show off, and to get ahead. But this evening had an unexpected addition, a young boy named Ethan Lewis. Ethan didn't belong in this room. The 11-year-old boy was dressed in a slightly wrinkled button-down shirt, jeans with the knees worn out, and sneakers that had seen better days. He sat at the edge of the massive poker table, his legs barely touching the floor, looking completely out of place among the glittering wealth surrounding him. His mother, Sarah, was working in the kitchen, quietly preparing hors d'oeuvres and cleaning glasses. Sarah had been Richard's personal assistant for years, but she knew her place. She knew her role was to serve, not to be seen. Ethan had grown up in the shadow of Richard's wealth, sitting silently in the corner while his mother worked. He was used to it, but tonight felt different. Tonight, something in the air felt heavier. Richard, sitting at the center of the table, caught sight of the young boy. A devilish smile crept across his face. He knew exactly what to do. It wasn't enough to just have these people admire his wealth. He needed to teach a lesson, to remind everyone of their place in the world. "Hey, Ethan," Richard called out, his voice cutting through the clatter of cocktail glasses and hushed conversations. "I think it's time you joined us. Ever played poker?" The room grew silent. All eyes turned toward the child in the corner, waiting for his response. Richard's voice was laced with a mockery that everyone could feel. There was no way this child, coming from the type of background he had, could even begin to understand the complexities of poker. "No, sir," Ethan replied calmly, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying a certain sharpness, a quiet intelligence that was barely noticeable under the surface. Richard chuckled. "I'll tell you what. Let's make a deal. You play one hand of Texas Hold'em with me. If you win, I'll pay for your tuition to any school you want. A full scholarship, no questions asked. If I win, well, your mother will pack up and leave. No more job, no more security." The words hung in the air, sharp as daggers. The room shifted slightly, the people around the table exchanging knowing looks. This was what Richard did. He played games, he owned people's lives, and he loved to remind them of it. "Go ahead, kid," Richard said, with a flick of his wrist. Tossing a few poker chips toward Ethan. "Let's see what you're made of. Show me why you're not just some poor boy with a mum who cleans dishes." A wave of laughter rippled through the crowd. Phones began to buzz as they snapped pictures of the scene. The crowd wasn't interested in Ethan's poker skills. They were only here for the spectacle, the poor child against the rich billionaire. Everyone knew how it would end, or so they thought. Ethan looked at the chips, his fingers moving over them with precision, as though calculating something in his mind. He didn't look up at Richard. Instead, his gaze flickered to the people at the table. He had studied them for years, watched their tells, their habits, their weaknesses. He knew these people better than they knew themselves. "Deal the cards," Ethan said quietly. Vincent Castellano, the professional poker dealer who had been shuffling the deck, paused and glanced at Ethan. His eyes flickered with curiosity. He'd been dealing poker to New York's elite for decades. But tonight, something about this game felt different. Vincent dealt the cards, his hands smooth and practiced. The first two cards were dealt face down. The room fell silent. All eyes were on the young boy who had just been thrust into the lion's den. Richard picked up his cards: ace of spades, king of hearts, one of the most powerful hands in poker. He smiled smugly, sure that victory was in his grasp. The other players began to chuckle quietly. It was supposed to be fun, a game to entertain the masses. But as the game began, something in Ethan's demeanor changed. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't intimidated. He sat there, calm and composed, as if he belonged at the table just as much as anyone else. He wasn't a child. He wasn't the help's son. He wasn't just some quiet observer. Ethan Lewis was about to show them all why intelligence cannot be measured by the color of your skin or the size of your bank account. The air in Richard Montgomery's penthouse felt thick with anticipation. The mood had shifted. What was once an amusing spectacle now felt like a real game. As the poker table sat in the heart of the room, the players exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that they weren't about to witness an ordinary display of wealth and power. Richard leaned back in his chair, arms casually draped over the armrests, his smirk still in place. He had every reason to feel confident. After all, he was facing an 11-year-old boy. Ethan was a child. He had no experience, no understanding of the sophisticated dynamics at play. Or, so Richard thought. Vincent, the seasoned poker dealer, shuffled the deck once more, his fingers moving with practiced precision. The room fell into a hushed silence as the cards were dealt. Richard looked at his 2 cards with the smug satisfaction of a man who knew he had the upper hand. Ace of spades, king of hearts. It was a strong starting hand, one that many professionals would bet big on. Ethan's cards came next. He turned them over with a slight flick of his wrist, barely glancing at them. 7 of spades, 8 of spades. A pair of suited connectors, not particularly strong, but with potential. A straight is possible, he thought. If the right cards come, most children would have felt nervous. They would have folded under the pressure of Richard's cold stare. But Ethan's hands were steady, his fingers cool as they slid over the poker chips in front of him. He wasn't worried about his hand. He was worried about reading the people around the table. He had watched Richard play this game countless times. He knew how Richard's eyes twitched when he was uncertain, how his fingers twitched when he was bluffing. He had catalogued these small unconscious behaviors for the past 3 years. Every poker night, every dinner party. This wasn't just about the cards. It was about playing the players. And right now, the player that Ethan needed to focus on was Richard Montgomery. The crowd leaned in. The phones were already out, recording this moment. The rich elite whispered among themselves, betting on how long it would take for the young boy to fold in fear or be outsmarted by the billionaire. Richard tossed his chips into the center with a flourish. $50. Let's start easy, shall we, kid? The tension in the room thickened. Everyone was watching to see what Ethan would do. Would he fold? Would he try to bluff? The consensus was that Richard would crush him in minutes. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands hovering over his chips. The decision weighed heavily on him, but not because of the money. He wasn't concerned about that. It was the psychology of the moment that mattered. How could he throw Richard off his game? How could he make him doubt his superior hand? Instead of folding, Ethan pushed his chips forward. I call. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A simple call. It was a basic move in poker, but it wasn't the reaction anyone had expected. They had all anticipated that Ethan would fold under pressure. But here he was, matching Richard's bet with calm precision. Richard's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected this. The boy had guts. Vincent dealt the flop. 6 of spades, 9 of hearts, and 5 of clubs. Ethan's hand was coming together. A straight draw. If the next card was a 4 or a 10, he would complete the hand. 31% chance of success. Richard's face barely changed, but his body language shifted. He leaned forward, his fingers subtly moving toward his watch, a tell that Ethan had noticed countless times. Richard was nervous. The man who ruled the business world, who had crushed his competition without a second thought, was showing a crack in his confident demeanor. 200? Richard's voice was more forceful now, as if trying to intimidate the young boy, to make him think this was all too much for him. Ethan thought for a moment, then did something unexpected. Instead of folding or raising, he simply checked. The crowd was taken aback. In professional poker, checking with a hand like Ethan's was a bold move, especially when faced with a large bet. But Ethan had learned from his grandfather that sometimes the best move was to show weakness when you were holding strength. The room fell into silence as Vincent dealt the turn card. The 4 of diamonds appeared on the table. Ethan's heart skipped. He had done it. He had the straight. His 7 and 8 of spades, combined with the 5, 6 and 9 on the board, gave him an unbeatable hand. Richard was still holding his ace, king, nothing more than an over. His hand had missed the turn completely. Richard stared at the cards, clearly not understanding what had just happened. His confidence faltered for the first time. The child had drawn exactly the card he needed. The room grew even quieter, sensing the subtle shift in the air. Richard leaned back in his chair, trying to regain his composure, but his fingers moved toward his watch again, a sure sign that his confidence was slipping. The mighty Richard Montgomery was starting to doubt himself. 200, he said it more quickly now, hoping to bully Ethan into folding. But Ethan was calm, calculating. He had the winning hand. He could feel the growing sense of uncertainty in the billionaire across the table. He knew this was his moment to strike. Instead of calling, Ethan did something no one expected. He raised 500. The room erupted into murmurs of disbelief. Richard's smirk faded. A $500 raise from an 11-year-old child. The guts, the nerve, it was nothing short of audacious. Richard faltered for a moment, his eyes scanning Ethan's face, trying to read him, trying to figure out if this was a bluff or a mistake. The man had never once been made to doubt his abilities. The very idea that he might lose to this child, someone who didn't belong here, someone who didn't fit into his world, was too much to bear. Called, Richard finally muttered, his voice tight, as if forcing the words out. He couldn't back down now, not in front of his guests. Not when his pride was at stake. Vincent burned a card and dealt the river the 5th and final community card. 5 of hearts. A useless card for both players, but for Ethan, it didn't matter. His straight was already unbeatable. He held the nuts, the best possible hand in poker. Richard's chest tightened. He had nothing. Ace high. Ethan had already outplayed him, manipulated the pot size, and built a trap that had Richard walking straight into it. Check, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard, still not understanding what had happened, bet the rest of his chips, everything, hoping to salvage the game. All in. The crowd gasped. It was the move of a desperate man, a man who could no longer maintain his facade of control. This was no longer a poker game. This was about everything Richard Montgomery had built: his arrogance, his wealth, his worldview. All of it was on the line. I call, Ethan said, his voice unwavering. The room went silent. The moment of truth had arrived. The atmosphere in the penthouse grew thick with tension. What had started as a mere spectacle for the rich and powerful had quickly turned into something much more. The guests, once eager for the easy amusement of watching a poor child fail, now found themselves on the edge of their seats. The laughter had stopped. The phones, once poised to capture Ethan's humiliation, were now being used to record the unbelievable turn of events. The chips at the table sat heavy, a physical manifestation of the stakes at play. Richard Montgomery, despite his wealth and decades of experience, felt a chill creeping into his spine. The cards in front of him had been unforgiving. The asking was no longer the powerful hand it seemed. His mind raced as he fought to make sense of the situation. The young boy sitting across from him was doing something he had never expected. He was playing better than Richard himself. Ethan, on the other hand, was as calm as the eye of a storm. His focus was unwavering, his every movement measured. His mind calculating each possibility as if the game were an equation he had already solved. The room may have been filled with some of the wealthiest people in the world, but in this moment, he was the one in control. Richard's face twisted in frustration. His usual confidence, the swagger that made him invincible in his business dealings, was now completely absent. Ethan had raised him again. This time, with a $500 bet. The whispers around the room began to grow louder. Richard's pride was starting to erode. The calculations, the game's psychological warfare, was all coming together for Ethan. Every move, every decision had been crafted with an understanding far beyond his years. He wasn't just playing poker, he was playing Richard Montgomery's ego. You can't be serious, kid, Richard muttered under his breath, staring at his cards as if willing them to magically turn into something more. Ethan didn't respond. He simply leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, but his mind working at full speed. His hands weren't trembling. His breathing was steady. He was in control of the situation. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind. Poker's not about the cards. It's about reading the people. And Ethan had read Richard like a book. The signs had been subtle. Richard's hands were shaking just slightly when he called the last bet. A movement that only a trained observer like Ethan would notice. The billionaire's arrogance was a double-edged sword. It had made him blind to the weakness in his own hand, and now it was clouding his judgment. He had been bested, not by the cards, but by his own pride. "All right, Richard," Ethan finally spoke, his voice low and composed. "I'll call your bet." Richard glanced at Ethan, then at the chips in the center of the table. His heart pounded in his chest. The tension was unbearable. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was the billionaire, the powerful figure. He had dominated every part of his life, business, wealth, power, but here he was, playing a game of poker against an 11-year-old who had outplayed him at every turn. The flop had already been dealt, and now it was time for the final community card, the turn to drop. The stakes had escalated. If Richard thought he could intimidate Ethan, he was wrong. Ethan was the one who was in charge. Vincent, the poker dealer, burned a card and slowly revealed the turn, the 10 of clubs. The board now read 6 of spades, 9 of hearts, 5 of clubs, and 10 of clubs. Ethan's expression didn't change. His hand had completed a straight. The cards were aligned perfectly. But to anyone else in the room, it appeared as if Ethan was still calculating, still unsure. That was the beauty of his strategy. He'd made everyone believe that he was just a child, playing a game that didn't matter. Richard, on the other hand, had no such luxuries. His asking hand was completely useless now. He was holding nothing but bluffing with his pride. He glanced at the board again, looked at his cards, and then back at Ethan. The silence was suffocating. "I'll raise." Richard finally spoke, his voice tight with frustration. 1,000. He was attempting to assert his dominance once more, trying to regain the upper hand. His move was a gamble, but it was also a last-ditch effort. He couldn't afford to lose. Not in front of these people. Not after everything he had built. Ethan paused for a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle in. He stared at the board, as if lost in thought. Then, without hesitation, he pushed all of his chips into the center of the table. "Illin." The room gasped. It was a bold, dangerous move, one that most professional players would only make when they knew they were holding the nuts. The best possible hand. Richard's eyes widened. He was playing for keeps now. The billionaire leaned forward, his fingers twitching toward his watch. He wasn't just questioning the cards anymore. He was questioning himself. Was this kid smarter than him? The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, but Ethan didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid. He had seen this moment in his mind 1,000 times before. He had prepared for it. Richard's hand hesitated above the chips, his mind racing. The billionaire glanced at the faces around the table, then at his cards again. The room was watching him, waiting for him to fold or continue. The pressure of the situation built, and Richard's arrogance began to crack. Finally, with a long, tense sigh, Richard whispered, "Call." And with that, the final bet was placed. Ethan and Richard were locked in a battle for everything: pride, reputation, and the fate of Ethan's mother. Vincent cleared his throat and prepared for the reveal. The room fell into an eerie silence. This was the moment of truth. Who would walk away victorious? The room was still, save for the soft hum of the automatic card shufflers in the corner. Richard Montgomery sat at the poker table, his face a mask of concentration. Sweat clung to the back of his neck, and his hands, which had once moved with the steady confidence of a man who controlled his world, now trembled slightly as they hovered above the pile of chips. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. Across the table, Ethan Lewis sat perfectly still, his hands neatly folded in his lap. There was no fear in his eyes, no sign of hesitation. He had made his move, and now, the moment of truth had arrived. This was the culmination of years of practice, study, and quiet observation. Everything he had learned, everything he had internalized, would come down to these next few moments. Richard Montgomery had been outplayed. The billionaire's mind raced as he stared at the cards on the table. 6 of spades, 9 of hearts, 5 of clubs, 10 of clubs, and the final community card, the 5 of hearts. His hand ace of spades, king of hearts, was nothing but a bluff. A weak ice-high hand, compared to what Ethan had been building all along. Richard's usual confidence had dissolved, replaced by uncertainty. Vincent the dealer stood silent, his gaze flicking between the two players. He had seen his fair share of high-stakes games, but never one like this. The dynamic had completely shifted. What had started as a game of wealth and power was now a psychological duel. The billionaire had been outsmarted, and the young boy, once dismissed as a mere servant's child, was poised to win. Ethan's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Richard's internal turmoil. The billionaire could feel the eyes of the room on him, and he knew the stakes had escalated far beyond the money. His reputation was on the line. For Richard Montgomery, who had built his empire on dominance and intimidation, to be outplayed by an 11-year-old was nothing short of humiliating. As the seconds ticked by, Richard fought the urge to glance at his watch. His security blanket, the thing that had always helped him keep his composure. But the feeling that had crept in was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Doubt. Finally, with a resigned sigh, Richard placed his hands on the table and stared at the pot. "I call," he said, his voice hollow. He had no choice. The challenge had been set. It was now or never. Ethan didn't say a word. He simply nodded, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. The young boy's expression was still, but beneath that calm exterior, his mind raced, processing every move, every glance, every subtle cue he had picked up over the years. He had learned poker, but, more importantly, he had learned people. And Richard Montgomery was a book he had already read. "Show your hand," Vincent said, breaking the silence. The tension in the room was palpable. The outcome of this hand would change everything for both players. Richard reached for his cards, his fingers shaking slightly. He flipped them over with the same confident motion he had used earlier. The ace of spades and king of hearts sat exposed on the felt, ace high. Richard declared, his voice thick with frustration. "It's not much, but it's all I've got." The crowd remained silent, waiting for Ethan to reveal his hand. Richard's eyes narrowed, certain that the young boy would fold. He had to. The game had been rigged from the start. Ethan was nothing but a distraction, a mere sideshow to entertain Richard's guests. But Ethan was no ordinary child. He slowly turned over his cards, the 7 of spades and the 8 of spades. The room collectively gasped as the community cards were revealed. 6 of spades, 9 of hearts, 5 of clubs, 10 of clubs, and 5 of hearts. Ethan had the straight 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It was a hand so perfect, so undeniable, that Richard's mind couldn't fully process it. He had been outplayed, outsmarted. "I win." Ethan's voice was steady and calm, but the words sent shockwaves through the room. Richard Montgomery sat frozen in his seat, staring at the cards on the table. His mouth was dry. His eyes flicked back and forth between the hand he had played and the one that had just defeated him. He couldn't believe it. How had this happened? The room, once silent, erupted in astonished murmurs. The wealthy elites, who had come to witness the humiliation of a poor child, now found themselves witnessing a masterstroke of strategy. Jaden had outplayed Richard Montgomery with pure intellect, using psychology, game theory, and observation to dismantle the billionaire's carefully constructed world. Vincent stood from the table, his expression a mix of admiration and disbelief. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice tinged with respect, "what you've witnessed tonight wasn't just a game. This young man just demonstrated something that takes most professionals years to learn. What he just did was advanced psychology, strategy, and game theory at its finest." The room fell silent once again. The guests, who had once ridiculed Ethan, were now in awe. Their phones were still recording, but now, instead of mocking, they were documenting a victory. A story they would tell for years to come. Richard Montgomery's jaw clenched. His pride, which had once been his most valuable asset, now felt like an anchor dragging him to the depths. He had lost more than just a poker game. He had lost the very thing that had defined him: his belief in the superiority of wealth. The young boy had just proven that intelligence, not money, ruled the day. Angela Thompson, who had been silently watching from the kitchen, stepped forward. She had witnessed her son's transformation from invisible servant's child to undeniable force. The weight of the moment hit her like a tidal wave. The poker game had started as a way to humiliate them. But, in the end, it had changed everything. "My son," Angela said, her voice filled with pride. "He's more than you'll ever know." The room was silent again. The guests, once too arrogant to recognize the value of a child like Ethan, now felt the sting of their own assumptions. The balance of power had shifted, not in money, but, in truth, Richard Montgomery, once the king of his empire, stood up from the table. His legs wobbled slightly as he took a step back. He glanced at his cards one last time, as if hoping they would magically turn into something more. But there was no turning back. He had been outsmarted, defeated, and somewhere deep within himself, he knew that this loss would haunt him for the rest of his life. The silence that enveloped the room was deafening. For the first time that night, the laughter had completely stopped. What was once a casual poker game for the elite had turned into something far more profound: a reckoning. The guests who had come to watch the spectacle of a child being humiliated by a billionaire were now faced with an uncomfortable truth. Ethan Lewis, the poor overlooked boy, had outsmarted Richard Montgomery at his own game. Ethan didn't smile, didn't boast. His victory wasn't in the money, it was in something much more valuable: respect, dignity, and the truth that intelligence could never be confined to one social class. He had done more than just win a poker game. He had made an undeniable statement. Richard Montgomery stood at the table, his body rigid, his face pale. His mind was still racing, trying to comprehend how this had happened. He had everything: wealth, power, connections. And yet, in the most public of moments, he had been outplayed by an 11-year-old boy from a family with nothing but love and determination. As the realization set in, Richard's hands trembled. The chips in front of him, the very chips that had seemed like nothing but a means to entertain. His guests now felt like chains, dragging him into the depths of his own failure. How could he have lost to someone like Ethan? The young boy wasn't supposed to know the game. He wasn't supposed to have the mind for it. But now, Richard Montgomery had to face the bitter truth. The game had never been about the cards. It had been about underestimating someone. I don't understand," Richard muttered, his voice almost lost in the tension of the room. Vincent, the professional poker dealer who had been observing the entire exchange, stepped forward. He had been in this business long enough to recognize true skill when he saw it. And what had happened in this room was nothing short of a masterclass in poker strategy. "Richard," Vincent said, his voice steady but laced with a new kind of respect, "what you just witnessed wasn't a child playing poker. It was a genius reading people, controlling the game with his mind, and outplaying you in every sense." The words hung in the air. Richard's face reddened, not from anger, but from the crushing weight of humiliation. It was clear to everyone in the room now that he had been outclassed in every way. His arrogance, his belief that wealth and status made him invincible, had blinded him to the brilliance sitting across from him. The guests who had gathered to watch Richard's show of superiority were now silent. The phones, once poised to capture Ethan's downfall, were now documenting something entirely different. The underdog had triumphed, and the world was watching. Angela Thompson, Ethan's mother, stepped forward, her eyes never leaving her son. She had watched Ethan grow from a quiet child into a young man who was far more than anyone had given him credit for. The moment she saw him raise Richard's bet in front of all those powerful people, she knew that something had changed. He wasn't the scared little boy anymore. He had become a force that could no longer be ignored. "Ethan, you've done it," Angela said, her voice trembling with pride. Her eyes filled with tears as she approached him and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. You've shown them what we all knew." Ethan looked up at his mother, his expression softening for a moment. "It's not about showing them, Mum." He paused, then continued with quiet resolve. "It's about showing them what they never bothered to see." The crowd, which had once been so quick to judge Ethan based on his appearance, now saw him for what he truly was, a brilliant young mind capable of outthinking the most powerful people in the room. They had underestimated him from the start, and in doing so, they had missed the real treasure in their midst. Richard, still processing the events that had just transpired, finally spoke. His voice was low, filled with the weight of his failure. "I thought you were just the help's son. I didn't think you could understand. ... Ethan's gaze sharpened as he turned his attention to Richard. "You thought I was just a kid. That I didn't belong here." His voice carried a quiet but powerful edge. "But you never bothered to see me for what I am. You never saw my worth. You judged me by my background, by what I was wearing, by the color of my skin. You thought that made me less, but now? You see." The room fell into a deep, contemplative silence. For the first time, the guests weren't just witnessing a poker game, they were witnessing a shift in the way they viewed the world. The truth was undeniable. Intelligence cannot be bought. It cannot be confined to privilege or to wealth. And it certainly isn't something that can be measured by the color of someone's skin. Richard Montgomery's pride had been shattered. The billionaire who had spent decades building his empire on a foundation of wealth and superiority now found himself stripped of the very thing that had once defined him, his belief in his own The world he had built on arrogance was now crashing down around him, piece by piece. Richard's eyes flicked to his guests, their gazes now different, less admiring, more uncertain. The people who once looked to him for validation were now seeing him for what he truly was, a man who had built an empire on false assumptions. The walls he had built to protect himself were now crumbling, and the truth was standing right in front of him, in the form of a young boy who had seen through the illusion. As the room began to disperse, the whispers started. Ethan's victory was the talk of the night, and soon, it would be the talk of the world. The viral footage of Ethan Lewis destroying Richard Montgomery's assumptions about intelligence would spread far and wide. News outlets would pick up the story, and social media would explode with praise for the young boy who had defied all odds. But more importantly, Ethan's life was about to change forever. His hard work, his quiet study, his ability to observe and learn, would no longer go unnoticed. Richard Montgomery's humiliating defeat wasn't just a personal victory for Ethan. It was a symbol for anyone who had ever been underestimated or dismissed. As the final guests trickled out of the penthouse, Ethan sat back in his chair, his hands still resting on the poker chips in front of him. He glanced at his mother, who was standing nearby, tears of pride in her eyes. "We did it, Mum." And with that, the two of them walked out of Richard Montgomery's world and into their own. The poker table, once the stage for wealth and dominance, had now become the place where assumptions were broken, and true potential was finally recognized. The last vestiges of Richard Montgomery's empire, his wealth, his status, his pride lay in ruins. Ethan and his mother had proven that sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the world is the assumption that you know who someone is before they get a chance to show you. And for the first time, in that grand penthouse overlooking the city, Ethan knew that the future was his to create.